Other questions, responses to what you've heard from our last four speakers, really? Go ahead.
Bert Leufkens, MIB Netherlands. I would like to ask the panel the following. I saw that most of the comments were made in relation to bring a product to the market, including HTA and etc. And I was wondering how the panel looks at what's happening in the context of life cycle approach when a safety issue pops up or a certain other issue is there. How do we see harmonization when the product is already on the market? And could you comment on that?
Ned's got a finger on the microphone, so just push. Yeah.
I do, but I'm waiting to see if someone else did it first. So I want to make sure I understand the question, which I think was directed to post-market surveillance and harmonization on that. And I don't know if Doug's still here and wants to speak to that at all, but I mean, I think there are a lot of efforts underway to even just start to aggregate data relating to post-market surveillance. And I think that that has to build upon pulling together surveillance of adverse events in a meaningful global way, which I think starts with probably, like a lot of these things, some kind of standardization of terminology, and then pulling the systems together. And I think there are efforts underway within countries and maybe within regions. I don't know that we're there yet in terms of really then harmonizing how we review based on that. But Doug, I don't know if you want to speak to that. He says no, he doesn't. So, so I think it's an important step. I think it's an important step. I think it's probably one, when we go back to the business case concept, it's probably a little bit harder to make the business case on that as compared to for inspections and for applications, where I think there's such obvious inefficiencies and redundancies at this point in time. There's much clearer, much more common sense that there needs to be that kind of project to pull it all together. But I think there's definitely a case to be made, and I definitely think there's a road to go down. I just think we're a little further behind on that.
Yep.
So when you say managing in the life cycle after a drug is on the market, I'd split the problem into two. One is data accumulation, and the other is decision making. Now, with decision making, I don't see a complete harmonization immediately around the corner, because that is very much where it goes into the practice of medicines, the legal systems. I mean, just look at Avandia, Avastin, we have seen this. And here I think the goal is to have mutual information, so, and as we have done with Avandia, I think that was a very successful one, but that's probably for the time being as far as we can go. With regards to evidence generation, I think there is a lot of room for harmonization. Why would you want to do one particular study in post-licensing or a registry or whatever it is in one country and do probably the same thing in another one if you could do complementary things? So I think there is a lot more room for harmonization, and I think there the discrepancy between pre and post licensing isn't as big as it might be at first sight. I hope that answers your question partially.
Toshito Minaga again, Osaka City University, Japan. Remarks regarding what Dr. Ahira said. As to the tactics, first of all, thank you for citing my discussion about the levels. But about the tactics, you said the cultural thing. I think to use culture as an excuse to avoid harmonization or prevent harmonization is a bad idea. By doing the scientific discussion, this is, after all, this science or regulatory science, probably the society by society, the maximum amount of risk which can be taken can be different. But the culture is the too vague term, I guess. So to discuss out and avoid the culture thing, Japan has been using the culture as an excuse conveniently in the past, but that's a wrong approach in harmonization. Thank you.
I wonder if I maybe make a comment on that.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
Be careful, Alan. Yeah.
But also, I was actually going to make the point in relation to Bart Lufkin's last question. I know there's a cultural thing, but when we spoke in our breakout session, for example, post-marketing surveillance, in many of the Middle Eastern countries, there is not a tendency for physicians to report adverse events. They just don't have that within their medical practice or their medical culture. So I don't think it's an excuse, but I think it is in some ways a barrier to harmonization because medical practice in this particular area isn't harmonized. So it's maybe a cultural thing, but it affects how these events are actually reported.
You got to.
Culture is too big.
Yeah, but culture is probably too big, but yeah, I agree.
Hi, my name is Judith Kramer. I'm from Duke University and associated with the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which is a public-private partnership that Duke and FDA started to try to improve the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. So I'm an outsider to the usual fora in the group that's, I know many of the people in the room, but I'm not one of the people that's been involved in harmonization all along. And so I'm sort of observing from the outside, and I just was motivated to speak after I heard Hans-Georg and Tom make the comment about one size doesn't fit all, and the differences in terms of potential strategy, depending on what you're talking about. I have to say, when I saw the agenda for this meeting, I was amazed the scope of what was covered under one topic of regulatory harmonization, because my sense, being involved in the clinical trial side, is that the issues there and the motivations, the costs, the strategies are very different than the sides of regulatory science that might involve the regulatory science involved in helping small agencies deal with new science and new therapies, how you approve stem cell therapies, et cetera. So I just want to say that it might be, I just want to support what both Hans and Tom said about teasing these out, because I think the solutions become easier when you have the risks better aligned. For instance, in the clinical trials arena, I think there's what Hans said is absolutely true. There is a complete connection between the public health demand to find therapies for unmet need and the limited capacity to do global trials. We do not do single-center trials anymore. We do multi-regional trials, and there is limited capacity to the extent the regulations add an impediment that's not well reasoned on science. We all suffer. The patients also suffer. It's not just industry that has to spend a lot of money and do a lot of work. The patients don't get the therapies as fast. The regulators, the scientists are not happy with it. So there's very close alignment, and I've been tremendously encouraged by seeing people coming together to solve some of those problems recently, and there is really increasing alignment. In this meeting, there was discussion in our group on the pre-approval side of an alignment on the safety issues, that there aren't as many differences as people are quoting between Europe and the US. So that may be an easy win with some, essentially, as you say, some safe harbor discussions, some pilots demonstrating, in fact, that the regulatory structure and legal structure already exists. And yet there are other things that are vast and they're different. So I would support the concept of not lumping all of regulatory into one thing and thinking you can solve it with one solution.
Thank you. Can't agree more with that one. Does the panel want to comment on that at all? We'll just go on to the next. Okay, go ahead.
Larissa, optiv FDA. I just wanted to make a comment in response to the discussion about the post-marketing harmonization, post-marketing trials and studies. As we all know, post-marketing trials and studies are often very large studies. They involve tens of thousands of patients sometimes. They happen to be non-inferiority studies most of the time. And harmonization is needed in this area, not only in the criteria as to when to require post-marketing studies in both Europe and the United States and maybe other countries, but also what would satisfy a regulator when the study is done, when it's a huge study, a lot of resources have been spent, what would be the correct way of doing it, and the criteria that would satisfy the regulators. So in addition to that, risk management plans and risk mitigation strategies are also extremely expensive, and they would have to be incorporated in healthcare systems. Again, there is a lot of need for harmonization in this area. For example, really very simple example, EU has a risk management plan, and US has a RAMS template. And so these two documents are not necessarily harmonized. And so this small technical thing could potentially be harmonized, and the same risk management plans formats could be made between regions. So just in response to that, yeah, there is a lot of room for improvement in harmonization for post-marketing endeavors. And second comment is, again, to return to the rare disorders area. This is another area where, and I would like to say it for the record, because it is an area where a lot of unknowns still exist. Many diseases don't necessarily have a good description of their natural histories. It is difficult to run studies for rare disorders. They're oftentimes multi-regional, multi-national studies, and you don't necessarily have enough patients, and you have to go to one clinical trial. And if this one clinical trial is done and has to be done correctly and has to be done in the right way with sufficient scientific support, and if it's accepted in multiple regions, then it will only be for the benefit of the patients. Thank you.
Thanks.
Wanted to just address the Paul Koplin, Purdue. The organizational dynamics of the task that we're talking about. Because what we have is different organizations which have strong hierarchies, strong organizational leadership, vested interests, particular cultures, and that may be just an institutional culture or a national culture or a corporate culture, that are having to come together to create a common framework, a common that needs leadership and commitment of resources and compromise. So it becomes an organizational challenge, in addition to all of the great ideas that we've heard. And Deborah referred to, well, we need people whose day job this is. And I think that's clearly a necessity. The secretariat that Lambert referred to being critical for success, it often depends on how impartial that secretariat is, because if you have these different organizations, how do you create that common leadership, that common discipline, common timelines? And that's where an impartial leadership really becomes valuable. And one type of example of that would be, say, a management consulting company, perhaps like, well, I wouldn't use any particular names, who's there just to do the organizational dynamics, just to provide the organization, the leadership, set the agendas, but they have no particular vested interest in their particular organization's success or dominance of ideas. Their interest is merely getting the job done.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments from our panelists? Any last comments, or Tom, anything else? Okay. I want to just thank all of you. We've got giving you some extra time this afternoon. I wanted to leave you with a thought really inspired by Peter Hutt here, the Carpe Diem approach. We don't need to wait to do a lot of these activities. Each of the groups that are represented here have the wherewithal, power, force, creativity to take some of these steps. Yes, we're going to see a workshop report, and I'm sure the forum will look at it and others and try to organize some specific responses, but there's no reason to wait. So go forth and converge. Thank you very, very much.